cocaine and heroin east. And so now it's different. Now we're starting to see more of it going into our eastern states than before. But 10 years ago, it was specifically west. A lot of people don't realize that Iowa and Missouri were tied for the top states in the nation for illegal meth labs. There were several months in there that we held the record for the top 2 states in the nation. 6 years ago, Polk County, Iowa, so imagine the population of Polk County, Iowa. Polk County, Iowa and Salt Lake City and Phoenix were in a 3-way tie for the number of methamphetamine arrests in the United States. And so the population of Polk County compared to those 2 metropolitan cities, we were in a 3-way tie. So methamphetamine has been a major problem in Iowa. And even with our pseudoephedrine law, it still is a problem because now we're seeing it imported. We're getting more drugs into the state, brought in through our interstate systems, and actually through FedEx, through mail systems, we're finding it coming into the state rather than actually being manufactured here. Okay? But this particular piece of the law was, anytime a child can hear, see, smell the production of methamphetamine or the chemicals that can be mixed together to create meth. And so it wasn't just methamphetamine. This is going to jump really fast to law enforcement because methamphetamine is a felony. So any type of related crime with it is a felony. So this is going to jump really fast to criminal code. These are just some of the things that can be mixed together to form methamphetamine. There's some pretty nasty things up there. Okay, but then let's think about it from a child's standpoint. First of all, for all of us, the number 1 item up there that is most dangerous to all of us is anhydrous ammonia, all ages. That is the worst thing on that list. But from a child perspective, the second worst thing on that list is coffee filters. And that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. But if a coffee filter has been used to filter methamphetamine production, we're talking about what's in the coffee filter is raw methamphetamine crystals. From a child's perspective, depending on what was mixed together, the crystals could be a light pink. Cherry Lifesavers, strawberry pop, very enticing to a child to have pink rock candy. It could be a light brown color. It could be like Coca-Cola, caramels, root beer. It could be totally clear. On a hot day, ice. In fact, that's another term for methamphetamine. Or diamonds, I'm rich. So from a child's perspective, that coffee filter with raw methamphetamine in it can be the second most dangerous thing on that list. The largest age group, or the consistent age group for methamphetamine usage and production is our 25 to 35-year-olds. But those are also our primary childbearing years. And so we're finding a lot of methamphetamine labs and drug houses, et cetera, do have children. The other thing is that they're into the drug production, they're not into public safety. And so they're not going to take time to put everything in a biohazard bag, they're not going to take time to dispose of it appropriately, so it's a risk to the general public when there's methamphetamine anywhere around. Romeo was 4 years old when he drew this picture. 4-year-olds generally are getting ready for kindergarten. Okay, most 4-year-olds can count at least to 10. Most 4-year-olds know their alphabet. They know the jingle, A, B, C, D. So most of the time they are getting ready for kindergarten. Romeo is 4. He's not ready to start kindergarten. He can't count past 8, so he's functioning from a slight mental injury. Okay, so he's not too far off it there. But he doesn't know his alphabet. He doesn't know the jingle. He isn't ready to start kindergarten. But Romeo can do something that, thank heavens, my grandkids can't do, and hopefully yours can't either. Romeo can draw a meth lab. The item on the far right corner over there is actually an intravenous or an IV bag for injecting methamphetamine. The 3 pictures on the upper left actually is the distillation process for methamphetamine. And if you haven't seen a self-portrait of a 4-year-old lately, the little figure that's above the uppercase C in the bottom left-hand corner is Romeo. Romeo drew himself into the meth lab because he knew he'd been there enough to know what it looked like. If these guys showed up right now, I'd panic a little bit, and I know why they're dressed that way. But think about it from a child. That bright yellow is fascinating to the baby. They're just enthralled with that color. What about an older child? The aliens have just arrived. They show up, the respirators, they show up in these suits. We're talking about outer space, we're talking about aliens showing up. But look at the difference in the way the baby is dressed that's in a meth lab as compared to the rescue workers. What we have to protect ourselves and wear in difference in what the child is wearing. We're not going to spend time on this particular piece of it. You do have it in your materials. You need to realize that when we are talking about drug addiction, caretakers, parents as caretakers, when we're talking about drug addiction, they reaches a point they are not child focused. They no longer are paying attention to what's happening with the kids. Their parenting skills, they're not involved with what's happening with the children. It's all the drugs. And so the children are going to be in higher risk situations. You're talking about prostitution. You're talking about, illegal drugs. You're talking about theft. So there's a lot of high risk situations when we're talking about addicted parents and caregivers. Bestiality in the presence of a minor. Basically what this means is either the caretakers are encouraging the child to have sex with animals, or the caretaker is having sex with animals in front of the children. Sometimes I'm naive and I would say, hey, not in Iowa. Okay? We had a 17-year-old, profoundly developmentally disabled, that was having sex with any animal that crossed the city square. Okay, so he's 17, so we have a child. We have bestiality, so we have a circumstance. Oh, where's the caretaker? And so in this particular case, the caretaker is going to be charged. They're going to be charged either with bestiality, because they didn't do anything about it. They're going to be charged with bestiality by omission, because they failed to keep the child safe, or they're going to be charged with denial of critical care, lack of supervision, physical health, mental health. And so it's going to be, the caretakers that are going to be charged in that case. We had a child psychologist that worked for Ottumwa Regional Health Center, so access to children in southeast Iowa. His computer wasn't working, so he took it to Best Buy at Coral Ridge Mall outside of Iowa City. When Best Buy cracked his hard drive, it was solid bestiality photos, solid child pornography photos. Okay, he was sentenced to prison. He actually died on a prison bus. Now, supposedly from a heart attack, and I say supposedly, because when you're talking about child sexual perpetrators, it doesn't matter, the people that are in prison, it doesn't matter what they're in for, murder, all kinds of horrible things. Nobody likes a child sexual perpetrator. And so child sexual perpetrators, especially male child sexual perpetrators, are usually isolated. They're kept confined. I know that there's a slight difference that at first a female perpetrator is like, ugh, and then there really almost kind of reaches an acceptance of it. So women are not isolated as often as men are when they have been found guilty of a child sexual perpetration with it. He died on a prison bus. Now the biggest problem is that they're having to literally go through all of those photos to say, do we know these kids? Are these Iowa children? Are these kids that we need to deal with in other ways because they have been involved in a child abuse situation, especially a child sexual abuse situation? It is going to go to law enforcement, and it will be charged with child endangerment. In addition to that, probably a dual thing, by omission and also denial of critical care. From 2006 to 2009, the code actually was cohabits with a registered sex offender. But basically the way it was written, it almost sounded like it was the child's fault for living with a registered sex offender. So July of 2009, the law was changed slightly, that it is the caregiver's responsibility to not allow access a child to a sexual perpetrator. And so they added some other things to it. So it does count, the natural parent, a child custody situation, age 14 is that marker. If you're talking about physical or mental disabilities up through age 17 to adulthood. So they actually added some ages to it to say, our kids need to be protected. The problem is that they left some exceptions to it. The exceptions being that if it is the parent that is on the registered sex offender, they are able to have contact with their children. You can't say parents can't spend time with their children. Obviously, it needs to be supervised. There's where the problem comes in. If the registered sex offender is married to the caretaker, so say I own and operate a child care center, a preschool, and my spouse is on the registry. Okay, you can't say that my spouse can't live with me, that he's just because he's a jerk, you can't take my livelihood away from me. Okay, it's an exception. What about if it's one of my minor children that's on the registry? You can't say my kids can't live with me. And so unfortunately, there are enough exceptions to it that this really, a lot of times, once again, is not going to count. And so when this happens, it is going to go, that it's going to be reported to law enforcement. It will go with child endangerment. But in addition to that, it's going to be charged as denial of critical care. Lack of supervision, mental, physical health, life-threatening, etc. And so there's going to be additional charges even if they can't charge based on the actual law. And then in 2010, starting July 1st, there is a new section to the code. And that allows access to obscene materials. And as far as definitions are concerned with obscene materials, you can see the different things that would be considered as materials, which would also include your electronic devices as well as hard copy, and then what is obscene. And so this piece of the law started July 1st of 2010, not to allow children and obscene materials. Prior to the law coming into effect in 2010, we had a situation that was called in to me just to say, Di, I need help here, what are we going to do? It was a stepfather who was seated at his computer. He was sending electronic pornographic material to his 15-year-old stepson on his cell phone. And so he was sharing pornographic material, obscene material, with his stepson via his camera phone. At the same time, his biological 3-year-old son was sitting on his lap watching what was happening on the computer. There was not a law against that. Law enforcement couldn't touch it, Department of Human Services, nobody could touch that case because it was not against the law. Starting July 1st of 2010, it is against the law to allow access to obscene materials. So if that case were to come up now, it would be charged. We're going to talk for just a few minutes about statistics. Okay, now the statistics, I'm going to actually jump back and forth between 2008 and 2009 because the statistics weren't kept in a consistent means those 2 years. Okay, but when we're talking about the Department of Human Services and cases, in 2009, there were just under 25,000 cases that were actually reported to the Department of Human Services. Okay, of those cases where we had enough evidence to say that it had happened, that it was a founded report, there was shy of 9,000 of the 25,000 cases where they could say we actually had the evidence and it was founded. Unique children mean that some families have more than one child involved. So that's why there's 12,000 of those in 9,000 cases. And then we're going to talk about the definitions of founded, confirmed, etc. when we're talking dependent adult abuse. We'll wrap it all up. When we're talking about 2008, 5-year-olds and below are most at risk, and that holds true for 2009. In fact, that's held true for most of our years as far as different types of abuse issues. And so it's our youngest of our young children that are the ones that are being abused most often. When we're talking about the different types, and this is 2009, so allows access to a registered sex offender is on there, but allows access to obscene or pornographic material isn't on there. And you can see that we had types of reports, that we had evidence on reports. Most of them were that denial of critical care, or those basics, our human rights. Now, as far as bestiality and prostitution being 0, doesn't mean it didn't happen. It means it's a statistic, and so it actually would be like 0.0025 that dropped off the chart. So we did have cases. They obviously weren't as many as some of our other categories. Most of the time, 75% of the time, when we have enough evidence to say that a case happened, most of those are new cases, not repetition. So it's not the same family being reported over and over. 75% of the time, this is the first time that a family has been involved in that kind of a situation. Statistically, it shows that boys and girls are abused pretty evenly. Statistically, it shows that girls are sexually assaulted more often than boys. But that's really a reporting problem. What I have heard is, if you tell, I'll cut it off. And to a guy, that's a pretty major threat. I'm not going to tell, And so we're finding, though, that more men are reporting sexual abuse as children than we're finding women reporting it, because the women reported it when they were girls. The guys didn't. And so it's more of a reporting process than the fact that boys aren't sexually assaulted pretty equally. And then toilet training. I mean, that is a really tough time both for kids and for caretakers. When we're talking about abuse of children, generally we are talking about the parents, and we're talking about a female caregiver, because more women own and operate child care centers, babysit, etc., than men do. When we're talking about domestic violence situations, there are usually kids involved, and they are high-risk situations with it. In the last 15 years, there were 138 women that lost their lives in a domestic violence situation. There were 24 men that were murdered. There were 42 innocent bystanders, people that just happened to be there, that were murdered. 25 of them were children. There were 168 kids that had a parent murdered in a domestic violence situation, and there were 62 kids who watched one of their parents being murdered. And so there's a definite link with domestic violence and child abuse. When we're talking about homicide or the death of a child, especially when we are talking about shaken the slammed baby, I would have said it was boyfriend first, then father, then mother. But in fact, statistically, father is generally the perpetrator, then the boyfriend, then the mom. I'm going to stop as far as the child abuse portion is concerned. The rest of the material on child abuse, such as, how are the reports, how they're investigated, what's the result, etc., we're going to be covering under the dependent adult abuse section because they are very, very similar. So we're going to break at this time. It is important, you do have to watch both sections of the film in order for it to qualify for your mandatory reporter training. So take a break, but you've got to watch the second film.